Agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iraq, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. Geir Pedersen, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria. Mr. Thomas Fletcher, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Mr. Wad El-Khatib, filmmaker and co-founder of Action for Sama, and Mr. Bada Jamous, Chair of the Syrian Negotiations Commission. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Geir Pedersen.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm now briefing you from Syria. I'm here together with Syria for some 54 years fell in 2 short weeks. Syria now faces a whole new reality. But, Madam President, let me start by reiterating my sincere condolences for the hundreds of thousands of Syrians who have lost loved ones over these nearly 14 years of conflict, and my solidarity with the millions who face displacement, exile, destruction, detention, abuse, suffering, and loss through the conflict, and also for the decades under the former regime. I express my heartfelt solidarity with families still searching for information about their missing loved ones. Madam President, it seems unreal, but it is only 11 days since the fall of the former regime. But I have already had the pleasure of meeting with a whole range of actors, and my outreach to the Syrians will continue. I hear hopes and I hear fear. There is a profound and shared sentiment among Syrians that this new situation belongs to them, that it is their moment to realize their legitimate aspirations. There is a great hope that Syria now has a real chance to move towards peace, economic stability and growth, inclusion for all Syrians, and accountability and justice. But, Madam President, many are apprehensive about the future. The challenges ahead are enormous. I worry that if this is not handled right by both the Syrians and the international community, a turn for the worse again is possible. Let me update you on the situation on the ground, outline the challenges Syria faces, focus on what the political transition process requires, and address accountability too. As you are aware of, in Damascus, a caretaker authority has assumed power, installed by the leadership of the Military Operations Command, the dominant armed coalition in Syria, which is led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and its commander, Ahmed al-Shara. So far, this caretaker authority is composed of ministers from the Syrian Salvation Government that had been de facto the governing authority in Idlib for some years, under the leadership of Prime Minister Mohammed al-Bashir. At the same time, and this is important, Madam President, there are armed opposition groups that operate outside of the military operations command. For instance, parts of the Syrian National Army, most of which acts under the auspices of the opposition Syrian National Coalition. In addition, the northeast, as well as some neighborhoods of Aleppo city, remains under the control of the SDF, supported by the US. There have been significant hostilities in the last 2 weeks before a ceasefire was brokered between Turkey and the United States along the Euphrates River. A 5-day ceasefire has now expired, and I am seriously concerned about reports of military escalation, as well as reports of military buildups. Such an escalation could be catastrophic. Madam President, moreover, there is a new situation in the southwest. UNDAF continues to observe IDF personnel and equipment in multiple locations in the area of separation, and one location in the area of limitation in the vicinity of the Bravo line. There are media reports of Israeli advances several kilometers into Syrian territory. Israel has carried out more than 350 strikes on military facilities, equipments, and supplies across Syria since the former regime fell, and these continue, including an enormous attack in Tartus. Madam President, such attacks place a battered civilian population at further risk and undermine the prospects of an orderly political transition. We have also seen reports of the Israeli cabinet's plan to expand settlements in the Golan. Israel must cease all settlement activity in the occupied Syrian Golan, which are illegal. Attacks on Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity must stop. Madam President, let me now move to the challenges that Syria faces. The first major challenge is, of course, that the conflict has not ended. Yes, we are seeing a Syria that is stable at present in many parts. Many in Damascus tells me that the law and order improved significantly after 2 initial days of instability. But stability can be fragile in many parts of Syria. And in the northeast, there are still front lines and open hostilities in which civilians are being killed, injured, and displaced. Civilians must be protected wherever they are. There must be de-escalations towards a nationwide ceasefire, as well as efforts to address tensions between military factions. The second challenge is the sheer scale of needs. Syria's economy has been ravaged by this dreadful conflict, its infrastructure destroyed, 90% of Syrians living in poverty. Let me just stress that these are enormous challenges that will require all of our support in the manner that will have to go beyond the humanitarian in terms of economic development, reconstruction, and the process to address and ultimately end sanctions. And of course, Madam President, the third challenge is of course political. The Syrian people have sacrificed so much so that they can determine their own future and realize their legitimate aspirations. We must ensure that the political process remains on track. Otherwise, I fear new instability. Madam President, before traveling to Damascus, I joined representatives of the Arab Contact Group on Syria, along with ministers and representatives of Bahrain, France, Germany, Qatar, Turkey, the UAE, the UK, US, and the European Union. This meeting expressed a common belief that the transitional political process must be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned and produce an inclusive, non-sectarian and representative government formed through a transparent process based on the principles of Security Council Resolution 2254. The Aqaba statement emphasized support for my mandate. In addition, Madam President, I think there is broad understanding that Resolution 2254 cannot, in the new circumstances, be applied mechanically. But the core principles have wide Syrian consensus. And while Resolution 2254 identified two parties, one of whom has been toppled and cannot feature in the process, it is still the case that the political transition is needed and that this will require an inclusive intra-Syrian process. Madam President, what can this look like? First, Syrians need an orderly transition that provides for preservation of state institutions that serve their interests and provide them with critical services. Here, let me take note of the efforts to ensure this already, in terms of safeguarding ministers of the former government to transfer power and calling on state employees to continue their work. This provides a strong first basis, but it is not in itself enough. Second, the transition must also be credible and inclusive, including the broader spectrum of Syrian society and Syrian parties, so that it inspires public confidence. And here let me emphasize that this is a clear desire expressed by Syrians themselves. Just as we saw significant military coordination between many groups in the recent operations, now, as we are moving forward and into a full political phase, this should be matched by inclusive political engagement. Third, there must be a new constitution in line with Resolution 2254. Fourth, there must be free and fair elections inclusive of all Syrians, as Resolution 2254 envisages, in accordance with international standards. And, Madam President, here let me say, I fully appreciate the need to ensure quick service delivery and law and order. Stability is fundamental. Competence is key too. But none of this is incompatible with a credible and inclusive political transition. It is precisely such an approach that can enable stability and indeed prevent new conflict. Madam President, I have discussed all of these elements in depth in Damascus. I met with the commander of the new administration, Mr. Ahmed al-Shara, and Prime Minister of the caretaker authorities, Mr. Mohammed al-Bashir. I also met here in Damascus with representatives of the Syrian Negotiations Commission, including armed group representatives that remain in contact with the leader, Badr Jamous. I also met with Syrian civil society and women. It was heartening to see so many of them, for years speaking across front lines, now together in their capital here in Damascus. They continue to be at the forefront of the emergency response and relief to all Syrians. Their inclusive participation is a cornerstone to sustainable peace. Madam President, concrete movement on an inclusive political transition will be key in ensuring Syria receives the economic support it needs. There is clear international willingness to engage. The needs are immense and could only be addressed with broad support, including a smooth end to sanctions, appropriate action on designations too, and full reconstruction. It is clear that the period ahead will be critical, and there are international signals that broader measures can gain traction with progress on a credible and inclusive political transition. This was an important theme in Aqaba, which stressed that Syria at last has a chance to break decades of isolation. This chance, Madam President, must be seized. Finally, let me note my meeting with Syrian women here in Damascus, as well as the engagement of my office with women across Syria and those in exile. Syrian women seek assurances that their status and rights will be respected and built upon in any transitional arrangements, with the needs of women and girls fully taken into account. Because the reality remains that Syrian women these last years have reported significant backlash. And not only this, Syrian women must be a part of the transition itself. Otherwise, it cannot be considered to be inclusive. Madam President, yesterday I saw with my own eyes the dungeons, torture, and execution chambers of Sednaya prison. A testament to the barbarity of the fallen regimes towards its own people. I met a man released from Sednaya just 10 days ago who told me how he was tortured. An elderly woman, also recently released, said she wanted first and foremost justice. Another woman was desperately seeking clarity on the fate of her son, who was detained and whose 4 children she raised single-handedly. Of course, Syrian, UN, and other organizations have been documenting this for years, thanks to the courage of survivors and witnesses. But seeing the reality firsthand was a stark reminder of the centrality of transitional justice, the need for clarification of the fate and whereabouts of missing and disappeared persons, and ensuring due process in criminal prosecutions as a necessary safeguard against acts of revenge. Without this, Syria and Syrians will not be able to heal. And, Madam President, here let me stress an urgent first step: the protection of evidence and material, as well as sites of mass graves. We must safeguard the right of the victims and their families and survivors to both truth and justice. And we need the immediate release of all those still detained and arbitrarily across the country. Let me say that on this and across all fronts, I have been in contact with many parts of the UN system, and there is a determination across the system to strengthen the UN presence here in Syria. Madam President, Syria is for all Syrians. Now is the time for Syrians to step forward and lead. Now is the time to reassure all Syrians that their stake in the future is understood and that it will be embodied in a credible and inclusive transitional arrangements. I have made clear in Damascus my invitation to a dialogue on the Resolution 2254 and all other issues relevant to Syrians, so that we can identify a Syrian-owned and led way forwards. Madam President, of course, it is only 11 days since the fall of the former regime. My door is open, and I hope in the coming days we can build that dialogue. I understand, we all do, the massive challenges facing the authorities and the need to help concretely. No. We understand the need for stability, but stability will not last long if not built on credible and inclusive foundations. The time is to build those foundations now. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Pedersen for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Thomas Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you to Special Envoy Pedersen for his unflagging work, which I've had the privilege to see firsthand here in Damascus. Madam President, the pace of developments in Syria, as you've heard from Geir, over the past 3 weeks has been dramatic. What has not changed is the scale of the humanitarian crisis. Syria was already one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world, with 17 million people, more than 70% of the population in need of support. More than 7 million people were displaced across the country, millions more Syrians living as refugees. Nearly 13 million people were facing acute food insecurity. The recent escalation has only added to these needs. More than 1 million people were displaced in less than 2 weeks. Hundreds of civilians killed and injured, at least 80 of them children. Health services, water supplies, already corroded by years of conflict and declining funding, were interrupted. And more than 12,000 schools were temporarily shut down, affecting millions of students. With borders, commercial routes closed, there have been shortages of bread, fuel, and other key items. Likewise, the flow of humanitarian support was severely disrupted, with most organizations temporarily suspending operations. Several warehouses have been looted. Multiple aid workers from NGOs and the Syrian Arab Red Crescent lost their lives. Thankfully, Madam President, the situation has begun to stabilize. As I've seen this week, markets, roads, health facilities are reopening. Children have gone back to school. Aid operations are gradually resuming across most of our hubs, including Aleppo, Homs, and here in Damascus. It is critical that we adapt the humanitarian response to the new, if still rapidly shifting, conditions. And that is why I'm here. First, to ensure that we are coordinated. Over the past 2 days, I've been looking closely at our systems for working together. We want to further support humanitarian leadership by drawing flexibly from the resources from across our hubs, including the strength of the system in place for Syria. We're also finding more ways to work closely with cross-border actors in northeast Syria to align efforts, but also to ensure the safety of humanitarian actors. These efforts will ensure that we have a cast iron grip of the coordination effort, as clear a picture as possible of the emerging needs across the country, and that we can direct resources in a swift and agile way using all available channels. Tomorrow, I'll travel to Aleppo, where we are already embarking on this approach. OCHA's office there is bringing together UN agency teams and NGOs previously working in areas formerly controlled by the Assad government, with those working on the cross-border response. I then plan to visit Idlib, where humanitarian needs are among the most severe. As the situation evolves, and following my visit, we will also swiftly issue an overview of critical funding needs for the next 3 months. Madam President, the second reason for my visit is to ensure that the humanitarian community has the best possible conditions in which to work. While here in Damascus, I've met with representatives of the new caretaker government, including the commander of the new administration, Mr. Ahmed al-Shara, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Mohammed al-Bashir. I have been encouraged by these discussions. What will be an ambitious scaling up of vital humanitarian support. We have received assurances that they will facilitate the movement of aid personnel and supplies from neighboring countries, including from Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, for as long as humanitarian operations are required. Again, this includes routes into areas controlled by other parties in the northeast. The intensification of conflict between actors in northeast Syria and its potential humanitarian fallout is a case for concern and warrants urgent attention and efforts for de-escalation. We also received assurances that access to people in need will be facilitated wherever they are in Syria, including across lines of conflict and into the northeast. We received commitments on the issuance of visas, work permits for aid workers, and NGO registration documents. The resident and humanitarian coordinator and authorities are developing a set of guidelines on this. And we received commitments on protecting and respecting the principled nature of humanitarian operations. This includes the conduct of independent needs assessments and selection of beneficiaries, the choose our own partners, including those who have been working in government-held areas and those currently working in the northeast, and assurances that there will not be restrictions on employing women who are absolutely essential to our mission. Absolutely essential. These commitments alone will not relieve people's suffering, but they are an essential basis for us to scale up operations. Madam President, the third reason for my visit is to ensure that I can make concrete requests of the international community, including the Security Council. So from you, we need three things. First, strong, unequivocal messaging that international humanitarian law must be respected, both in any ongoing hostilities and in meeting people's basic needs. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Those on the move must be allowed to do so safely. The missing must be accounted for. And where hostilities have ended, landmines and explosive remnants of war must be removed. And, as the authorities agreed, unhindered humanitarian access to those in need, wherever they are, must be facilitated. A second request, we need more money. I recognize the generosity of donors for the Syria crisis over the years. Since 2016, more than $38 billion has gone to the UN coordinated appeals for Syria and for the regional refugee response. But this year's humanitarian appeal, the largest country appeal in the world right now, is also one of the most poorly supported. With just 2 weeks left in 2024, it is less than a third funded, the largest ever funding gap for the Syria response. Now is the time to invest in the Syrian people, to support flexible funds so that we can respond to changing needs. The UN Central Emergency Response Fund has already allocated $32 million to Syria this year. Now is also the time for member states to work on development support to rebuilding Syria, reducing dependence on humanitarian support, and maintaining essential services. A third request. We need all states to facilitate the humanitarian effort, including by ensuring that sanctions and counterterrorism measures do not impede humanitarian operations. I will travel next to Ankara to discuss the crisis with the government of Turkey. Turkey's facilitation of cross-border humanitarian operations in Syria for many years has been a lifeline. I will also be discussing the crisis with authorities in Lebanon and Jordan, who have been such generous hosts of Syrian refugees. Madam President, when war erupted in Syria 13 years ago, I was in Lebanon, just the short drive away that I took yesterday. And neither I nor anyone could have imagined then the full extent of the suffering the people of Syria would endure for more than a decade. The world let them down. We let them down. But there is now, as the Secretary General has said, an historic opportunity to put that right and support the Syrian people, especially women and girls, in their hope for a more peaceful future. I pay tribute to the Syrian people for their patience, but they have waited too long. Giving them this support now will take patience, creativity, and determination. The progress we make will be inconsistent, and the risks of failure great. But this should be a galvanizing project for the UN and for the humanitarian movement. And so, at a moment of hope and peril, we must rise to the challenge and back the people of Syria. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Wad El-Khatib.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the United Nations Security Council. On the 8th of December, millions of Syrians scattered across the world in refugee camps, in exile, or inside our homeland, held their breath as we watched the news. It was a moment we sacrificed everything for. A moment of joy, but also one of deep grief. A chapter in Syria's history that will forever remain bittersweet. For the first time, Syrian activists began announcing their real names, reclaiming the identity they hid for years out of fear. Groups from the early days of the revolution began to reactivate, inspired to think about their role in the Syria future. It was a moment of victory, born from years of unimaginable suffering. It's ironic how 8 years ago, this very week, I was forcibly displaced out of my city, Aleppo. I carried my 1-year-old daughter in one arm, my unborn baby in my womb, and my hard drives hidden beneath my clothes, containing the truth of our struggle. I didn't know if we would survive, but I held on one truth. The evidence of our suffering would remain even if I didn't make it. Since that day, many countries told us to accept the new reality, that they have normalized with Assad, a man whose regime killed our beloved ones, destroyed our homes, and turned our dreams to dust. I refused to believe it, but I began preparing myself for a life where I would never see a free Syria. Every day, I whispered to myself, if not for me, then for my daughters to see. When I made my film for Sama, I traveled the world sharing our story. Over and over, leaders, politicians, and diplomats said to me, we wish we have done more. We should have done more. Today, I stand here to tell you, you can do more. Yes, history repeats itself, but it rarely gives us the chance to correct our mistakes. This is your chance today. The fall of Assad regime did not happen in 11 days or through one recent battle. It happened because of the countless sacrifices, struggles, and the losses of the Syrian people. It happens because 13 million Syrians were forced from their homes, hundreds of thousands drowned at sea. Countless others died in bombed schools and hospitals, and hundreds of thousands were detained, tortured, and forcibly disappeared. It happened when the Syrian people lost everything except their voices, their courage, and their hope. It was not announced with the military victories or grand declaration. It was civilians. 2 young men rode on a motorbike into an empty tank in Umayya Square. 4 women blasted Abdul Basit Sarut song, Thuri Thuri Dara, a prize Dara, in their car, waving to a future they had not yet seen. These were ordinary people, civilians, not soldiers, not even activists, declaring the fall of a tyrant. But this moment is not the end of our struggle. It's only the beginning of a new chapter. We ask this Council to act in line within Resolution 2254 and help us to achieve a real political transition, one that includes all Syrians from all regions and also the diaspora. The transition must lead to a new constitution and free, fair election. It must adhere to international standards of transparency, justice, and accountability. But this transition cannot happen without justice. The Assad regime has turned Syria into a theater of unimaginable crimes. Families have been searching for their beloved ones for over a decade. In recent days, the release of detainees from Sednaya was a tragic reminder of this brutality. Heartbreaking videos of chaos outside prisons filled our screens, families desperately searching for loved ones, while documents burned and records were destroyed forever. The regime cruelty was not just about detention. It was about erasing lives, silencing truth, and leaving families in endless uncertainty. Wafa Mustafa, my dear friend, whose father was detained in 2013 and whose fate is still unknown until today, asks a question that broke us all from our hearts. Where was the UN? Where was the ICRC in those critical days? Why am I supposed to identify my father's body on Instagram? Why are we seeing documents and IDs scattered on the ground, these precious pieces of evidence of our beloved ones? They could hold the only truth about what happened to them, and yet we are being denied even that. Madam President, the international community must act. Families for loved ones deserve access to the truth, access to every prison, to every mass grave, to every part of justice. The bombing must be stopped. Israel's recent strikes are blatant breach of international law. They must be held accountable for that. The protection of civilians is vital. In northeast Syria, violence and instability continues to devastate lives. A unified, coordinated approach is urgently needed to build a safe, stable future for all Syrians. And do not forget also the millions of Syrian refugees all over the world. Their future remains frozen, their dignity denied. These are not numbers. They are families, mothers, fathers, and children who deserve stability and the chance to rebuild their lives. Madam President, for too long, Syria has been left to bleed while the world debated and hesitated. For too long, we have been waiting for action. The time for excuses is over, and this is the time for action. We, the Syrian people, have shown the world our resilience, our courage, and unwavering belief in freedom. I'm asking you to stand with us, to support our demand for justice and accountability, and to help us build a political transition that reflects the dream and sacrifice of all Syrians. And to my fellow Syrians, whether in camps, in exile, or still holding on inside our homeland, we carry today a great responsibility. The sacrifices of the past 14 years have brought us to this moment. We must rise together, united, to rebuild our country with justice, dignity, and freedom for all. This is our chance, and we cannot let it split away. To all oppressed people around the world, to political prisoners, to the displaced, and to the refugees, hope lives in every voice that refuses to be silent, in every heart that refuses to give up. Hold on, because the freedom is coming, and it belongs to us all.